The Mark Chapter 14 torpedo was the United States Navy's standard submarine-launched anti-ship torpedo of World War II. This weapon was plagued with many problems which crippled its performance early in the war, and was supplemented by the Mark Chapter 18 electric torpedo in the last 2 years of the war. Nonetheless, the Mark Chapter 14 played a major role in the devastating blow U.S. Navy submarines dealt to the Japanese naval and merchant marine forces during the Pacific War. By the end of World War II, the Mark Chapter 14 torpedo was a reliable weapon which remained in service for almost 40 years in the U.S. Navy, and even longer with other navies. Development. The Mark Chapter 14 was designed in 1930 to serve in the new fleet submarines, replacing the Mark Chapter 10 which had been in service since World War I and was standard in the older S-boats. Although the same diameter, the Mark Chapter 14 was longer at 20 feet 6 in, and therefore incompatible with older submarines' 15 feet 3 in torpedo tubes. The Mark Chapter 14 was designed at the Naval Torpedo Station, Newport, beginning in 1922. It had a fairly small warhead and was intended to explode beneath the keel where there was no armor. This required the sophisticated new Mark Chapter 6 magnetic influence exploder, which was similar to the British duplex and German models, all inspired by German magnetic mines of World War I. The Mark Chapter 14 shared this exploder with the concurrently designed surface ship Mark Chapter 15 torpedo. The Mark Chapter 6 exploder, designated Project G53, was developed behind the tightest veil of secrecy the Navy had ever created. Exploders were tested at the Newport lab in a small field test aboard US Raleigh. At Ralph Christie's urging, equatorial tests were later conducted with Indianapolis, which fired 100 trial shots between 10 degrees north and 10 degrees south and collected 7,000 readings. The tests were done using torpedoes with instrumented exercise heads. An electric eye would take an upward-looking picture from the torpedo. The magnetic influence feature would set off some gun cotton. Inexplicably, no live fire trials were ever done with production units. Chief of Naval Operations William V. Pratt offered the hulk of Cassin-class destroyer Erickson, but prohibited the use of a live warhead, and insisted the Bureau of Ordnance pay the cost of refloating her if she was hit in error. These were strange restrictions, as Erickson was due to be scrapped. Buord declined. A service manual for the exploder was written, but, for security reasons, not printed, and locked in a safe. In 1923, Congress made NTS Newport the sole designer, developer, builder and tester of torpedoes in the United States. No independent or competing group was assigned to verify the results of Mark Chapter 14 tests. NTS produced only 1.5 torpedoes a day in 1937, despite having 3 shifts of 3,000 workers working around the clock. Production facilities were at capacity and there was no room for expansion. Only 2,000 submarine torpedoes were built by all 3 Navy factories in 1942. This exacerbated torpedo shortages. The Pacific Fleet Submarine Force had fired 1,442 torpedoes since war began. Controversy. The Mark Chapter 14 was central to the torpedo scandal of the U.S. Pacific Fleet Submarine Force during World War II. Due to inadequate Depression-era peacetime testing of both the torpedo and its exploder, the defects tended to mask each other. Indeed, much of the blame commonly attached to the Mark Chapter 14 correctly belongs to the Mark 6 exploder. These defects, in the course of fully 20 months of war, were exposed, as torpedo after torpedo either missed by running directly under the target, prematurely exploded, All struck targets with textbook right-angle hits and failed to explode. Responsibility lies with the board, which specified an unrealistically rigid magnetic exploder sensitivity setting and oversaw the feeble testing program. Its pitiful budget did not permit live-fire tests against real targets. Instead, any torpedo that ran under the target was presumed to be a hit due to the magnetic influence exploder, which was never actually tested. Therefore, additional responsibility must also be assigned to the United States Congress, which cut critical funding to the Navy during the interwar years, and to NTS, which inadequately performed the very few tests made. Board failed to assign a second naval facility for testing, and failed to give Newport adequate direction. Well-documented failures. On the 24th of December 1941, Commander Chiral D. Jacobs in Sago fired a total of 8 torpedoes at 2 different ships, with no results, and had become very frustrated when 2 additional merchantmen came in view. He took extra pains to get it right, pursuing for 57 minutes and making certain TDC bearings matched perfectly before firing 2 torpedoes at each ship, at an average of 1,000 yards, very close range. All missed. A few days after he discovered the torpedoes were running too deep and corrected the problem, Jacobs detected a big, slow tanker. Again, his approach was meticulous, firing 1 torpedo at a close 1,200 yards. It missed. Exasperated, Jacobs broke radio silence, openly questioning the Mark 14's reliability. A similar experience was had by Pete Farrell in Sea Dragon, who fired 8 torpedoes for only 1 hit, and began to suspect the Mark Chapter 14 was faulty. Uniquely, Lieutenant Commander John A. Scott in Tunney on the 9th of April 1943 found himself in an ideal position to attack aircraft carriers Hyo, Junyo, and Taiyo. From only 880 yards, he fired all 10 tubes, hearing all 4 stern shots and 3 of the Bose 6 explode. No enemy carrier was seen to diminish its speed, though Taiyo was slightly damaged in the attack. Much later, intelligence reported each of the 7 explosions had been premature. The torpedoes had run true, but the magnetic feature had fired them too early. Dan Daspit carefully documented his efforts to sink 19,000-ton whale factory ship Tonan Maru 3 on the 24th of July 1943. He fired 4 torpedoes from 4,000 yards, 2 hit, stopping the target dead in the water. Daspit immediately fired another 2. These hit as well, with no enemy anti-submarine combatants in sight. Daspit then took time to carefully maneuver into a textbook firing position, 875 yards square off the target's beam, where he fired 9 more Mark 14s and observed all with his periscope. All were duds. Daspit, suspicious by now he was working with a faulty production run of Mark 14s, saved his last remaining torpedo to be analyzed by experts back at base. Nothing out of the ordinary was found. At Pearl Harbor, despite nearly all his skipper's suspicions about the torpedoes, Admiral Thomas Withers refused to deactivate the torpedo's Mark 6 exploder, arguing torpedo shortages stemming from inadequate production at NTS made it impossible. As a result, his men did it on their own, doctoring the patrol reports and overstating the size of ships to justify using more torpedoes. Only in May 1943, after the most famous skipper in the subforce, Dudley W. Marsh Morton, turned in a dry patrol, did Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, Commander Submarine Force Pacific, except the Mark VI should be deactivated, but waited to see if Bureau of Ordnance Commander Admiral William Spike Blandy might yet find a fix for the problem. The Bureau of Ordnance sent an expert to Surabaya to investigate, who set the gyro backwards on one of Sargo's trial torpedoes. The potentially deadly setting, guaranteed to cause erratic running, was corrected by Torpedo Officer Doug Rimes. Though he found nothing wrong with maintenance procedures, the experts submitted a report laying all the blame on the crew. Problems. The Mark Chapter 14 torpedo had 4 major flaws. It tended to run about 10 feet deeper than set. The magnetic explode often caused premature firing. The contact explode often failed to fire the warhead. It tended to run circular, failing to straighten its run once set on its prescribed gyro angle setting, and instead to run in a large circle, thus returning to strike the firing ship. Running too deep. The torpedo tended to run some 10 feet too deep for several reasons. The first was that it was only tested with an exercise warhead filled with water to set the depth. However, the live warhead contained more mass than that, and it reached buoyancy equilibrium at a lower depth. Also, the depth mechanism was designed prior to the warhead's charge being increased, making the torpedo even heavier overall. Furthermore, 2 depth testing devices used by NTS to verify results were both off by the same amount in the same direction, which compounded the problem. After hearing of the problem, most submarine skippers simply set the torpedo's running depth to 0, risking a broach. By August 1942, the faulty running depth situation was in hand and submarines were getting more hits with the Mark Chapter 14. However, curing the deep running problem caused more prematures and duds, as more hits were being achieved. The number of sinkings did not rise. A more serious reason for the torpedoes running deep was hydrodynamic flow effect on the torpedo's depth sensor. The pressure tap for the torpedo had been placed in the rear cone section where the measured pressure would be substantially lower than hydrostatic depth while the torpedo was moving through the water. The torpedo's depth control engine was therefore given erroneously shallow depth indication and responded by trimming the torpedo to run deeper. This was finally addressed in the last half of 1943 by relocating the sensor point to the midbody of the torpedo where hydrodynamic effects were minimized. Premature explosions. Many submarine commanders in the first 2 years of the war reported explosions of the warhead with little to no damage of the enemy. The magnetic exploders were triggering prematurely, before getting close enough to the vessel to destroy it. Earth's magnetic field near NTS, where the trials were conducted, differed from the areas where the fighting was taking place. Dud's early reports of torpedo action included some dud hits, HUD as a dull clang. In a few instances, Mark 14s would strike a Japanese ship and lodge in its hull without exploding. The contact pistol appeared to be malfunctioning, though the conclusion was anything but clear until running depth and magnetic exploder problems were solved. Daspert's experience was exactly the sort of live-fire trial Boord had been prevented from doing in peacetime. It was now clear to all at Pearl Harbor the contact pistol was also defective. Ironically, a direct hit on the target at a 90-degree angle, as recommended in training, would usually fail to detonate. The contact pistol functioned reliably only when the torpedo impacted the target at an oblique angle. Circular runs. There were numerous reports of the Mark Chapter 14 running erratically and circling back on the firing boat. This is known to have sunk at least one submarine, Julie B. Likewise, Sargo was almost sunk by a circular. The subsequent Mark Chapter 18 torpedo was no better, sinking tang. The Mark Chapter 15 torpedo had collars to prevent circular runs, but the Mark Chapter 14 was never given this feature. Solutions. Against orders, some submariners disabled the magnetic influence feature of the Mark VI exploder, suspecting it was faulty. An increase in hits was reported. Shortly after replacing Wilkes in Fremantle, newly minted Rear Admiral Lockwood ordered a historic net test at Frenchman Bay on the 20th of June 1942. 800 torpedoes had already been fired in combat. More than a year's production from NTS. Jim Coe's skipjack did the honors, firing a single fish with an exercise head set at 10 feet, from 850 yards. It hit the net at a depth of 25 feet. Not satisfied, James Fife, Jr., followed up the next day with 2 more test shots. Fife concluded they ran an average 11 feet deeper than the depth at which they were set. Buord was not amused. Neither was the CNO Admiral Ernest J. King, who lit a blowtorch under the Bureau of Ordnance. The fact that destroyers Mark 15s were suffering the same failures may have had something to do with it as well. On the 1st of August 1942, Buord finally conceded the Mark Chapter 14 ran deep, and 6 weeks later, that its depth control mechanism had been improperly designed and tested. This satisfied Lockwood and Robert H. English, who both refused to believe the exploder could also be defective. Finally, in July 1943, Admiral Lockwood ordered his boats to deactivate the Mark VI's influence feature and use only its contact pistol. Christie, however, now an admiral and commander of the Australian-based submarines Southwest Pacific, insisted submarines in his command continue to use the magnetic exploder. Tests were carried out by COMSUBPAC Skelnery and torpedo officer Art Taylor. Taylor, Swede Momsen, and others fired war shots into the cliffs of Kahulaw, beginning the 31st of August. Additional trials, supervised by Taylor, dropped dummy warheads filled with sand from a cherry picker raised to a height of 90 feet, producing a 70% failure rate. A quick fix was to encourage glancing shots until a permanent solution could be found. In September 1943, the first torpedoes with new contact pistols were sent to war. After 21 months of war, the 3 major defects of the Mark Chapter 14 torpedo had at last been isolated. Each defect had been discovered and fixed in the field, always over the stubborn opposition of the Bureau of Ordnance. Once remedied, sinkings of enemy ships rose noticeably. By the end of World War II, the Mark Chapter 14 torpedo had become a much more reliable weapon. Lessons learned allowed surface ships such as destroyers to remedy the failings of the Mark Chapter 15. The two designs shared the same strengths and faults. After the war, the best features of the improved Mark Chapter 14 were merged with the best features of captured German torpedoes to create the hydrogen peroxide fuel. Mark Chapter 16 with a pattern running option. The Mark Chapter 16 became the standard United States post-war anti-shipping torpedo. Despite the large remaining inventory of Mark Chapter 14 torpedoes, nomenclature, official U.S. Navy naming policy had settled on using Arabic instead of Roman numerals to designate torpedo models since the 1917 development of the Bliss-Leavitt Mark Chapter 4 torpedo. However, many instances exist of the Mark Chapter 14 being referred to as the Mark 14 in official documentation and reports, as well as accounts by historians and observers. Characteristics: function, anti-ship, power plant, wet heater combustion, steam turbine with compressed air tank, fuel, methanol, length 20 feet 6 in. Weight 3,280 pounds. Diameter 21 in. Range. Speed. Low speed 9,000 yards at 31 knots. High speed 4,500 yards at 46 knots. Guidance system. Gyroscope. Warhead 643 pounds of Torpex. Date deployed 1931. Date withdrawn from service